live on YouTube.
Karen. Karen. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, we
Yep.
got some serious technical stuff going on. We've got Caleb. Can you guys hear feedback? Is that really good? You're good? You're good. Awesome. Okay, thanks. So I've got Caleb and Jared at the resort, and they are ready to go live. So when I turn the time over to Jared, it's going to be live on YouTube, which is super exciting. We are going live for the first time tonight, and you guys will once you excuse Jared, we're going to just be on a call right now. So during Jared's presentation, if you guys have questions, like always, just submit those through the chat, and we'll answer those on the call. And then after Jared's done, we have Tammy and a few others that should be on that I want to introduce. So you guys should see a split screen right now to see Jared. So, all right, Jared. We are excited. We're going to turn the time over to Jared to talk about reframing and rethinking exercise. Okay, tell you, Jared.
Cool. Thanks so much, Michelle. Super excited about trying out this live streaming thing. It's all. I wish everyone at home could see this setup in here because it's a little bit intense. Anyway, thank you for jumping on tonight, whether you're on the Zoom call or whether you're tuning in on YouTube. We want to talk a little bit about how we approach exercise. One of the quotes that comes up in one of our lectures in regard to nutrition is that our diet has changed more in the last 50 years than the previous 10,000 years. And I like to apply that same thought or same knowledge to how we approach exercise. The more that we are learning about our bodies now is allowing us to dig a little bit deeper and to be smarter with our exercise, with our workouts. And so I want to start out kind of looking at the traditional approach to exercise. So traditional approach to exercise programming is something called the FIT principle, which is an acronym that stands for frequency, intensity, time, and type, or time duration. And so the idea is if I know those four parameters, frequency, intensity, time, and type for cardio, and if I know those four parameters for strength training and flexibility, I can create an exercise program that meets the needs of all of those different components in an orderly fashion. And it's a tried and true method. It works. It worked then. It still works now. However, what we're learning is there are a lot more effective ways to approach it. And so I want to look at a different way to approach and quantify our strength training, a different way to quantify our cardiovascular training. And so part of that model, the previous model, the FIT principle, is it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of planning. It takes a functional understanding and knowledge of systems, the muscles, bones, those types of things. Already when someone is wanting to start something new, they're starting kind of behind everyone else because they have all of the muscles and then how to exercise those specific muscles and how much weight to do and how many sets and reps to do and all of these things, lots of confusion and for not as much output or actual work. And so we're going to talk about strength first. And so the way that I like to teach quantifying strength here at the resort is by using a basic physics principle. And so I'm going to write this out here. It's the basic idea that work equals force through a distance, or force plus distance. And, oops, I probably should spell my words correctly. So in terms of exercise, if we're talking about this word work, we could be, we could say that means caloric output. It's metabolic output. Those are our exercise burn calories. And so if we want to quantify that, we can do it pretty easily by knowing how much, if I know the force or the amount of weight and the distances traveling, I can kind of get a general understanding of how much work I'm doing. And so to kind of clarify this point, I want to use two different exercises to contrast how we can be more effective with our exercise approach. So a traditional approach, doing muscle groups, you go to the gym and maybe it's arm day. And so I've got to find exercises to work my bicep. And, the bicep curl is a very common exercise in the gym. And so I go into the gym, I pick up those dumbbells, I do my 8 to 12 repetitions, set them down, let the muscles rest. And I do that 2 or 3 times. And then I move to something else, a different exercise. But if we look at what we're getting out of those actual sets and reps, it becomes very small. If I've got a 10-pound dumbbell and I do a curl with that 10-pound dumbbell, I can measure the distance in which that is traveling and get a general idea of how much work or how much output I'm getting out of that rep for rep. And what we find is it's very, very little output. It's a fairly little amount of stimulus and moving through a limited range of motion, but it takes a lot of time. And so let's take that same approach and compare it to an exercise. And the one I always compare it to at the resort is something called the thruster. A thruster is a compound movement that is a combination of a front squat to an overhead press. So we have some type of weight that we hold at our shoulders, and we perform a front squat and then press that weight overhead. And so already, if we look at those basic ideas, already I've got more weight or more force than I would be doing a bicep curl, but the distance is traveling much greater than that fixed range of motion in the bicep curl. And so the weight starts at the shoulders, it drops all the way down to about where my waist is if I've got full functional range of motion in my squat, and then I press it overhead. The distance in that equation is traveling longer than the body is even tall. And so you couple that with more force, and what we find when we look at the actual measurements and the output, comparing one bicep curl to one thruster, as that one repetition of a thruster delivers 200 to 300 times the amount of output from one repetition of a bicep curl. And so if we plug that exercise like a thruster or some other compound functional multi-joint movement into that equation, and we plugged it into some type of interval system like Tabata intervals. I like using Tabata because it's pretty simple. It's 4 minutes of work, 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, and you repeat that for 4 minutes. And what we find specifically, if we look at 4 minutes of Tabata thrusters, the output that is created or generated in that 4 minutes usually equates to more total work or more total output than a person experiences when they go to the gym and they're there for 60 to 90 minutes when they're working one muscle group at a time, doing 2 to 3 sets of kind of going through that old school approach. So it's a much faster approach to it, and we get more out of it in that moment. The other implications that I like to bring up when we talk about this different model of quantifying our exercise is it's not limited to a gym session. A lot of times we have this idea that in order to get benefit from my exercise routine, I've got to go to the gym, I've got to be there for at least 30 minutes or at least an hour and get my sustained elevated heart rate or get my certain number of reps and sets. It takes a lot of time to do that. But the other way we approach this is our bodies don't approach exercise like that. The body doesn't know if I'm at the gym for 5 minutes or 60 minutes. It doesn't know if I'm at work walking up the stairwell at work or whether I'm on a stair climber at the gym. Our bodies are constantly responding to the environmental stimuli that are placed on it. And so when we look at it that way, and we can start to see that our body doesn't know if I'm at the gym for 60 minutes or whether I've found 6 10-minute blocks throughout the day. Ultimately, the work is the same. if you're doing that sustained, back to back for an hour straight, or 10 6-minute periods, 6 10-minute periods, ultimately the output ends up being the same. And not only that, but typically when we break our work or our exercise up into smaller chunks, we can do more over an extended time period in those smaller sets than we can in one gym session. A perfect example of that is, one of our Movara home fitness challenges that we did, that I did with a group, that I don't know if it's been repeated because it was miserable, was the 5 push-up mobile phone challenge, where we have a goal where every time we pick up the phone for any reason, whether it's social media, text messaging, email, phone call, before using the phone, you got to do 5 push-ups. And so the day that we did that, I did that challenge with the group. And what I found for myself was that not only did I use my phone way less than I normally do on a regular basis, but at the end of the day, when I calculated all of those sets of 5 push-ups up, what I found was I had accumulated over 200 push-ups throughout the day. Now, if I would have gone to the gym and I had a 60-minute time block, and in that 60-minute time block, I wanted to add 200 push-ups, I likely would not have been able to complete that same amount of work in that fixed amount of time. So by spreading it out, it allowed me to do more work at the end of the day. I had completed a lot more by spreading out than being able to sit down or to go to the gym in that one block of time to try to get everything done. Another implication that I really like in regard to this idea kind of takes the gym ego idea into account. One of the things when we become a gym rat, or we become into really exercising, we're constantly seeking that personal improvement. And so for strength training, one of the ways to determine that is through our 1 rep max. And I lost my marker. It's on the, can you grab that marker? It's on the ground right there. Bounce over there. So if we look at this idea of a 1 rep max, let's use the bench press, for example. So let's say my 1 rep max for the bench press is 225 pounds, which it is not. I'm just going to throw that out there, but it's going to make it for easier math. So for a 1 rep max bench press, let's say this is an empty barbell. It's 45 pounds. And on that empty barbell, I have 4 45-pound plates, right? So it's a total of 225 pounds. And 1 rep max ultimately means it takes every bit of strength that my body has to take that bar off the rack, lower it down to my chest, and fully extend my arms all the way back out just one time. So it's a lot of force on my joints. It's a lot of force on the muscles. It's a lot of force on the tendons and the connective tissue that connect the muscles to the bones for 1 repetition, right? And so let's, for a moment, play around with this. And now let's say we're going to take those 4 45-pound plates off that empty barbell. And now we have just 45 pounds. Now, if I do that same exercise, same range of motion, a 45-pound bar through the same range of motion, I do that 5 times. If I bench press that empty barbell 5 times, the total output or work equates to be the same as that 1 repetition at 225. The difference is at 45 pounds, I have much less stress on my joints. I've got much less stress on my muscles, much less stress on the tendons. And I can do more than 5 repetitions with an empty barbell than I can sets of 1 repetition with a loaded barbell. So I'm saving myself a lot of recovery time, and I'm being a lot smarter with my joints and the longevity of how my body is holding up by focusing on smaller weight and plugging it into an interval-based system that's going to allow me to get more out of those exercises than I would focus on more weight in smaller chunks or smaller sets and reps. So this is a really liberating approach to exercise, to be able to think about breaking it into smaller chunks, thinking, I don't need to get to the gym for 30 minutes. I don't need to do this specific machine. We can take any of those multi-joint functional movements We can plug them into some type of interval system, whether we're talking about Tabata intervals, or maybe we're talking about every minute on the minute, or an AMRAP, whatever it is, plug it into an interval system, and we're going to get more out of that time than the traditional approach where we're focusing on one muscle group at a time, doing lots of sets and reps. Not only is it more effective, and not only does it save us more of the time, but it also removes the need of any functional knowledge of anatomy. Because as I look at the movements that I'm doing, I don't need to know that the quadriceps and the hamstrings are the muscle groups that flex and extend my knee. But all I need to know is if I see that my knee is moving in an exercise, that the muscles that articulate that joint are moving. And so I don't need to kind of exercise program based on the muscle groups. I can just make sure that I'm doing a wide range of functional movements, plugging them into an interval system, and I've taken care of all of my strength training requirements with very, very little thought. And it's going to put me a lot closer to where I want to be than that traditional approach that becomes very monotonous, very boring, and it requires me to remember how much weight I did last time, how many sets and reps I did last time, and all of this tracking. So that's a different way to approach strength training, a different way to quantify strength training. Now I want to kind of switch the same idea and talk about cardio, changing from the traditional fit principle, frequency, intensity, time, and type, and talk a little bit about how we can be more effective with our cardiovascular training. Now, that same physics principle still applies to cardio. If we ask people, what burns more calories, running a mile as hard and as fast as you can, or leisurely walking a mile at a recovery pace. And ultimately, we're talking about the same resistance and the same force, our body weight, through the same distance. It's going to be relatively the same amount of output. And so that approach does work for cardio too, but I want to talk about a different approach. So usually our cardiovascular programming comes from using heart rate data to determine where we are working, the cardio zone or the fat burning zone, anaerobic zone, those types of things. Now, before we get to a smarter approach, I want to talk about where that idea comes from. So we have different energy pathways in the body, the anaerobic glycolysis system, aerobic glycolysis. We could talk a lot about the different energy pathways. But a long time ago, we discovered that at lower intensities, we are burning more calories from fat. In fact, at a resting state, sitting down or laying down, almost 100% of our calories burned are coming from fat sources. And then as our intensity increases, fewer calories come from fat, more calories come from carbohydrates. And so but it was discovered that we kind of found this fat burning zone where we get the most calories burned from fat without decreasing the total energy output. And usually that's thought to be between 60 to 80% of the maximum heart rate. And so that's what we have kind of accepted as the fat burning zone to operate in for 20 minutes. And this idea that we need to have our heart rate elevated for 20 minutes at least a 60% maximum heart rate. Now, I don't like to use heart rate as a metric for a couple of reasons. First of all, a lot of things can influence your heart rate. If I'm taking medication for high blood pressure, it might prevent my heart rate from passing a certain level. And so I might be operating 100% of my cardiac output, and my heart rate's telling me I'm at 65%. And that can obviously cause some issues. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, if I took a pre-workout supplement and that is stimulant based and it increased my heart rate data might be telling me that I'm at 90% when really I'm at 75 or 80%. And so there's a lot of fluctuation there, but even if it was accurate, it throws it off a little bit. And so I want to kind of use a case study of two individuals to kind of display why the fat burning zone approach to cardio exercise maybe isn't the best approach. And so if we look at two individual people, so let's say that this subject A and subject B are metabolically identical. They are the same height, weight, age, gender. They're the same body fat percentage. Everything is the same. The difference is that person A uses the fat burning zone approach to their cardio, and person B does not follow that same methodology. So they're going into a cardio workout, and for both of them, we're going to say it's a 20-minute run. So 20 minutes each, these two identical individuals. The difference is going to be that the subject A, who believes more in the aerobic zone or the fat burning zone, they want to maintain a lower percentage heart rate. And so let's say that they operate at, they're going to run for their 20 minutes at 6 miles per hour. Okay. And subject B wants to get a little bit more anaerobic, work in some higher intensity zones, and is running 10 miles per hour. Right. So this is probably around, the 65% of their maximum heart rate. 10 miles per hour is probably on the borderline of that anaerobic zone where they're breathing hard, really struggling to maintain, but they're able to maintain it for the 20 minutes. But it's the very top end range. Now, the distance in which subject A covers running 6 miles an hour in 20 minutes is approximately 2 miles. So they cover 2 miles in distance, and subject B running 10 miles an hour, they cover about a little over 3.25 miles. So over a mile difference. So they've got more distance. Now we can look at how the calories are burned, fat from carbohydrates. So this person was operating at a lower speed for less mileage, lower heart rate. Their total calories from fat were 65%, and that leaves 35% as carbohydrate-based calories. Over here, subject B, only 50% of their total calories were coming from fat, and 50% are coming from carbohydrate. And this right here is where this idea of the fat burning zone comes from. And if we stop the discussion right here, we would say, yeah, it makes more sense to work in lower intensity levels. But if we look at the full picture, more distance, more caloric burn, it gives us a more clear picture. So total calories of subject A in that 2 miles over that 20 minutes, we'll say is 200 total calories. And subject B, covering more distance at a higher rate, burned a total of 280 calories. And now if we split these down and look at the actual numbers of each of those, we find that 65% of 200 calories is 130 calories, and that leaves 70 calories as carbohydrates. And then over here, 50% of 280 is 140 calories from fat and 140 calories from carbohydrate. And so what we find is that not only do we have a net higher caloric burn, focusing on the higher intensity, but we also have more calories from fat. The only difference is it's a lower percentage coming from fat, but we're still burning more fat calories. We're still burning more net calories. And so I kind of get rid of the whole idea of the fat burning zone or using energy systems to create our baseline. The other thing that I kind of want to look at on this is an easier approach to looking at how we are exercising in regard to the heart rate. So if we don't have heart rate telling us how hard we're supposed to go in a group exercise class, what on earth are we supposed to use? So I like to use something called the RPE scale. RPE is an acronym that stands for rate of perceived exertion. So it's a scale from 1 to 10, basically on how hard you feel you are working. 1 would be sitting down, 10 would be on the very verge of our max effort capacity. And it operates very similarly to if you were to go to the doctor and the nurse says, where's your pain out on a scale from 1 to 10? We don't have this calculator that pulls out that gives us that information on what those different levels are, but we can say, oh, it's a 6.5 or a 7, and that information gives enough information to that professional to make decisions. We can use that same approach to our exercise programming and those different zones. The cool thing about utilizing the RPE, especially if you know what your cardio zones are and what your heart rate zones are, is that the RPE scale lines up with your heart rate scale from about 50% to 100%. So 50% to 100% on your heart rate scale equals 5 to 10 on the RPE scale. So 50% of your maximum heart rate would be a 5 on the RPE. 100% on the heart rate scale would be a 10 or a max effort. So if we're in a class, instead of the instructor saying you should be at 85% of your maximum heart rate, where in your mind you have to go, okay, well, 220 minus my age, that's my maximum heart rate. Now I'm going to multiply that by 0.85. And by the time we go through the math trying to figure out where we're supposed to be, we've already moved to a different zone. It's much easier to say, you should be at an 8.5. This should be pretty uncomfortable. You should be out of breath, not able to talk to your neighbor, those kind of subjective feedback terms, to give us more feedback with less information. And so the last kind of idea that I want to conclude with tonight is how we tie those pieces together. Because the traditional approach to exercise and fitness is based on the different components of fitness. So we have our strength training, we have our cardio training, we have our flexibility, we have our body composition, we have the motor related components like coordination, reaction time, agility, all these things. And we've got these different systems in place for each of those different components. And we don't need to. No, we don't move like that in general life. We're not switching from our cardio zone to our strength zone. We're constantly responding to the environmental stimuli. And so when we take those strength-based compound movements and we plug them into an interval system, what happens when we lengthen those sets out into intervals is there's a cardiovascular response. So if the heart rate is increasing during strength training, that doesn't mean it's not cardio. We're still getting cardiovascular benefit, even though in our minds we're doing strength training. And we see this all the time, even at the resort. We have largely interval-based strength classes. And if we mirror or monitor the heart rate data from a cardio class versus a strength-based class, we find that they're very similar in regard to what the heart rate is doing. And so we don't have to do strength training and then cardio. We can be smarter about the way that we're doing things and add compound movements to our cardio, or add cardio to our compound movements by making them more interval based in what we are doing. And if we do that, not only is it going to save us all the time in the world, it's going to make planning a lot easier. And we'll find out that we're getting better results, even though we're not spending nearly as much time in the gym, nearly as much energy in planning out our workouts, or focusing on all of the metrics to make sure that we're moving in the right direction. We're simply doing things for the right reasons. We are focusing on moving our bodies for the right reasons, doing the things that we enjoy. It just so happens that we're getting physiological benefit for it. We're becoming more fit as a result of living our life to the fullest, rather than trying to exercise to fit into this box to then live our lives more fully. Anyway, that's kind of a lot of concepts packaged in hopefully kind of an orderly way, but I'm happy to answer any questions that we might have briefly before we cut away. Yep.
And also not fixating on the heart of it, and listening to how you feel.
Absolutely.
I love been talking this myself when we're doing exercise and it's like we should be able to immediately talk back to me very comfortably. If you can carry on the conversation, sing a song, have people feel a little bit more intense.
Absolutely.
Looking for the best ways to help you exercise.
Yeah, and it's important to do that because exercise is a cultural thing that is specific almost to kind of this conditioning that we're brought in. There are other cultures around the world that the idea of going to the gym and running in place on a machine is a completely foreign object or a subject to that individual. And so it really goes back to doing things for the right reasons. I tell people all the time here, if you hate spin class and you're only going to spin class because that's the exercise modality that has shown that you burn the most calories and that more calories equates to more exercise and that's going to equate better results, I will tell that person 100 times out of 100 to stop going to spin class, because really why we are doing what we're doing, the motivation behind why we're trying to become better at something is more telling to me than what the actual program is. We want to be focused on the right things and then make sure that we're being the most beneficial with it. That's why I kind of love this message of changing the way that we approach exercise, because we have been conditioned to believe that exercise benefits are different than they actually are. I was going to say are more than they actually are, but we know that the exercise is great for us for hundreds of reasons, but we think that those reasons are different than they actually are. And why we are doing it makes a lot more sense than hyper focusing on having the perfect exercise program. We know that in terms of weight loss, at least, exercise is only 20% of the equation, and that's only if we're eating right. And so if we take that extra time that we're saving by hyper focusing on our exercise programming and we redirect that into meal planning and eating correctly and doing things for the right reasons, we are going to see much better results, even though that might not be the focus. And so that's kind of the approach, is doing it for the right reasons and then letting everything else kind of fall into place and taking that 20% and making it the most effective as we can by switching things up and adding some of these new principles into it.
Overcompensate all of our results. So the exercise is definitely to help us feel better, to give us that mental and emotional benefits. It can help with weight loss, but like you said, only if the nutrition is on point.
Absolutely.
Awesome, Jared. Well, a lot of really great information. I don't know if we have any questions from our YouTube followers.
We didn't have any from YouTube.
We do have, we're going to excuse Jared because we, on our calls, the first 30 minutes is live. And, but we have a giveaway. Those of you who are on our social media have been following and know that there is, and some of you have tagged. So we have a winner, and I don't know, Jared, are you able to see? Are we still live on YouTube?
Yeah, we're still live on YouTube.
So I don't know if we have a Bama Girl 1001 who's on, but we will tag her. She won my favorite hat. And so we'll go ahead and get that to her and DM her and get her address. So thank you guys for joining our live. All of the Movara homies, I want you to stay on the call. We're going to excuse again Jared, and then I'm going to answer a few more of your questions. But I think we're good for the live, Caleb.
Got it.
Okay, and I'm hoping to take